Hey guys, it's Mr. D. Welcome back. Hope you guys had a really nice holiday weekend. And here we are now enjoying 70-mile-an-hour winds and rain. So really making the best of the day. Okay, so where we last left off, we were looking at the impact of the Mongols and Genghis Khan. One of the more interesting figures in history, because the guy can be both a villain and a hero, really depending upon the way that you look at his actions or value impact that he had on the world. Yeah, the guy killed or was responsible for at least the deaths of millions of people, but he's also in the same regard, responsible for promoting trade and really kind of bringing the continents together. All of a sudden, because of his trade routes, Europeans are trading with Asians, and goods are moving from India into Africa. And all of a sudden, now we have a much more interconnected world as a result of Genghis Khan and his actions. So, what we look at, because of his actions, we're going to start to see more trade. Trade is really what's going to bring an end to the Middle Ages and push us into this new golden age of European history known as the Renaissance. Most of us know about the Renaissance. It's this great time of art. It's Leonardo da Vinci, and it's Michelangelo, and it's Raphael, and it's the sculptures, and it's the Mona Lisa, and it's all these amazing paintings. But there's a lot more to the Renaissance than simply just some really amazing artists producing some of the best pieces of work the world has ever seen. And that's what we're going to be looking at for this week, is really breaking down and understanding what the Renaissance is all about. Okay, so before we move into the actual Renaissance itself, there's some vocab terms that we need to look at and make sure that we're comfortable with. So the first vocab that you see is the term humanism. Humanism is the most important concept that comes out of the Renaissance. What we're going to find with humanism is that this is going to be a focus now on what human beings are capable of doing. During the Middle Ages and previous years before that, human beings basically lived as though that their lives were predetermined, right? We talked about during the Middle Ages that they were going to live, that they were going to die, they were going to be good Christians, and that they were going to go to heaven. And that was essentially, in a nutshell, their life. Well, what humanism is promoting is this notion that mankind can be more than that. Mankind can utilize its skill, its intellect to live outside of just this basic religious world and accomplish more than simply just being good Christians, living, dying, and hoping going to heaven. So that's what humanism is going to be when we go through the rest of the different readings that you're going to look at and some of these different individuals. You're going to see this focus of humanism keep coming up over and over again. And again, it's just this statement of mankind is more than simply just living, dying, and going to heaven, that they can be more, that value of the self, value of the individual is something that's going to be focused much more on. Okay, so the next term that you see down below is the term secularism. Secularism is going to be this shift away from an absolute obedience to religion. Now, guys, remember, throughout history, we've been talking about anything that mankind cannot prove, it simply relies on religion. It's God's will, it's the gods, it's the gods, it's the gods. Well, during the Renaissance, we start to see intellectuals move away from this reliance on religion for all answers, and they start to look more into science, and they start to look more into observation and scientific method and developing hypotheses and theories and really trying to get facts and figures behind their claims rather than simply just relying on religion. Now, let's be clear. They still very much are religious. They still believe in Christianity. They still believe in Jesus Christ. They still believe in God. They recognize the authority of the Pope. But what they're trying to do is get absolute or concrete answers that can be proven rather than simply just relying on religion. But again, they still are very much religious. They're still very much Christian. That's evidence the fact that the Roman Catholic Church hires scientists. We see that Renaissance painters often use biblical stories. So again, it's not as though during the Renaissance that people are just saying, oh, we don't believe in religion anymore. That's not necessarily true. All right, so the next term that you see is scholasticism. That one's easy. So that's just basically a push for academics. People are looking for provable answers. People are going to school more. There's an increased desire for people to learn how to read and write during the Renaissance. Now, of course, that's primarily going to fall to the upper class, but there is this push to learn how to read and write. Clergy is a term that we've talked about this year. Remember, clergy is just simply a member of the church. An aristocrat, we've talked about this as well. That is someone who is of a noble or a wealthy status. And also vernacular, we've talked quite a bit about this. Remember, we use the term vernacular as in common language. So it's words that you guys use that perhaps other people may not understand. Remember, the example I always use was when I was in ninth grade, we would use the term bomb to describe an outfit looking really good. Remember now, if you say bomb anywhere today, you're going to get tackled. So the idea of vernacular is it's a common language that people can understand, which is important because during the Middle Ages, remember, everything was written in Latin. And the only people that could understand or read Latin were members of the Roman Catholic Church, which rendered most of the citizens unable to read or write. But now that language and works and books and the Bible are now going to be published in common vernacular, it's going to give people access to knowledge and literature and the ability to read and write that previously they never had. So it's important to understand what existed before the Renaissance. What was going on in Europe prior to this golden age of arts and literature and science and advancements. And guys, it's important to remember that we're coming off of this age of feudalism where there was no interaction. Remember, when you were living on your manor, you lived on your manor, you worked on your manor, you died on your manor, you only interacted with people on your manor, you never actually left your manor. So the ability to learn or to culturally diffuse or to interact or to get exposure to different cultures, that just was not something that was capable or possible to happen during this time period. It very much was this dark age of learning where there was no learning actually going on. And then you get into the Crusades, where the Crusades finally start bringing people out of Europe. They start interacting with, they start to see the world. Even though the purpose of the Crusades was the Holy War and it was fighting between the Islamic world and the Christians in Europe, it still brought people together and it still started to, get Europeans to see exposure to different things in the world. And as a result, that generated a desire to reconnect with the world. And that's a really good thing. Now, the only drawback to this reconnection was the plague. We know that the plague is going to move on these trade routes, and unfortunately, when Europeans start moving off of the manors and they start moving into their cities, we know that the cities were the perfect breeding ground for the rats that were carrying the fleas, that were carrying the bubonic plague, and we know how much of a disaster that was. But after the plague subsided, what we're left with is still a desire to trade, and what we're left with is this desire to find new information and to move on into the world and to get exposure to new things. And because of that thought process, that desire to move on and to, rebirth, that's what gives way to the Renaissance. So guys, we talked earlier when we were looking at the vocab about humanism and the idea that it's kind of rejecting these religious ideas and really focusing more on what the individual is capable of doing. Really that celebration of self. So the first person that really was coined the founder or the godfather, I guess, of a lack of a better term, or the father of humanism is Petrarch. Petrarch wrote sonnets, which is essentially he wrote plays, but he wrote with a very humanistic touch, a humanistic feel, really allowing emotion and perspective and realism to emerge in his writing. What people really were like, what they were about, their hardships, their joys, their sadness, and that was something that didn't exist during the Middle Ages. The idea of the self was in itself selfish. It wasn't going to help them get to heaven. It wasn't allowing them to be a good Christian. But during the Renaissance, this is going to give people a time to be able to say, you know what, this is what I'm capable of doing. You can see that it brings back the Greco-Roman culture. Again, during the Middle Ages, Greco-Roman culture was not needed. The works of Aristotle and Socrates and Plato and great Roman philosophers and writers, those things were not valued because those things were not going to help you get to heaven. Remember, during the Middle Ages, the only focus was getting to heaven. So you were reading the Bible, you were going to church. You're not spending your time reading pieces of literature, especially written by non-Christians. That's just something that was not happening. During the Renaissance, it was a time of great change. So there was a lot of different things that were happening in different places, whether it was in art, whether it was in literature, whether it was in science. It was even happening in different places. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at each one of these bullets in a little bit more detail to help you understand what exactly was going on in the Renaissance in each one of these spots or aspects. During the Renaissance, one of my favorite things was this push for realism. What we found was this desire to really paint how people felt, to allow their expressions to be real, whether it was joy, whether it was sadness, allow their emotions to come through. During the Middle Ages, most art was expressionless. You didn't see what human beings really were like, their hardships, their miseries, their sadnesses. So when the Renaissance came out and happened, it brought with it that humanistic approach to really wanting to see what the humans were like, allowing artwork to not have to have figures be godlike, but to allow figures to be their natural human selves and to really kind of embrace um, the human rather than having to make it something, some type of mythical object, which in reality we all know it isn't. In order to have all of this great art, though, we had to have somebody finance and pay for it. And this is what happens with the Medici family. So the Medici family, they were rich, wealthy bankers in Florence. So what the Medici family did is that they would hire local artists and local sculptors and anyone with any type of skill to work for them, to paint for them, to do something for them. Now, guys, getting a Medici job, this was like playing for the Yankees. This was the biggest thing that a Renaissance artist could have. If you got commissioned by the Medici family, that really showed that you were the top tier artisan of whatever craft you were in. So this Medici family was also, they were rich, powerful bankers. Out of their family line, they had people become kings. They had people become popes. So they were not simply just, lovers of the arts, but this was one of the most powerful families during the Renaissance. But in terms of the art component to it, again, they were huge, what we will call patrons of the art. That they were really financing a lot of these great pieces that famous Renaissance artists were painting. So speaking of the city of Florence, there were three major cities in Italy during this time period that we need to be aware of. So the first is going to be Florence. Florence was the epicenter of the arts and the cultural movement in the Renaissance. This was the place to be if you were an aspiring artist or you're an aspiring sculptor or a writer. This was where all the best and brightest minds gathered. The city of Venice, which we know famously for all of its canals, Venice was very much a spot for trade. So this is where a lot of trade was happening, a lot of wealth was being accumulated, and it made sense because of the canals. It was easy for shipping lanes and for merchants to be able to move their goods in and out. And then lastly, we know the city of Rome, which is the capital essentially of the Roman Catholic Church and the Christian world. That was still the center of the Christian world. It's still headquarters to the Pope. And even during this time period, the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church would also hire a lot of these Renaissance artists to paint biblical stories. One of my favorites that I think of is Michelangelo with the Sistine Chapel, and also Leonardo da Vinci with the Last Supper. So even though that these artists are often recognized as being humanists, they also did work for the Roman Catholic Church and produce pieces for the Christian world. So the guy you're looking at goes by the name of Niccolo Machiavelli. So Machiavelli was a political scientist. He was somebody that worked hand in hand with kings and queens, princes and princesses, dukes and duchesses, anybody of royalty Machiavelli wanted to work with. And what he did is at the end of his life, at the end of all of his work with all these members of royalty, he accumulated all of his stories into a book called The Prince. The way that I think of The Prince is it's essentially a how-to guide for somebody should be a ruler. Machiavelli composed all of the good things and all of the bad things that he saw rulers do, and he put it all into a book basically as a blueprint for how, in his vision, someone should be a successful ruler. You're going to read a little bit more about Machiavelli and some of his famous sayings and some of the insights that he came up with, but that is essentially what he did, is creating this guide for how to be a good ruler in his vision. Just as Machiavelli was writing this book about how rulers should rule, there's another gentleman by the name of Baldassare Castiglione. Yeah, Baldassare Castiglione. What an awesome name that is. So what this guy is doing is that he's writing this book known as The Courtier. So what The Courtier was, it was a blueprint of how someone should act in the Renaissance world. Remember, life is changing. All of a sudden now people are having dinner parties and people are being invited to places, and all of a sudden your traditional manners that existed in previous generations or social expectations completely changed. So what Castiglione did is basically wrote a how-to guide for how to be a gentleman, how to act in situations, how do you dress, how do you speak, what should you wear, any of these basic things that somebody should know in social settings. That's what Castiglione wrote in his book. So in order to read The Prince and in order to read The Courtier, you have to be able to read. And this is where Johannes Gutenberg comes in. So Gutenberg is given credit for the printing press. Now guys, we got to remember, the printing press was actually created in China during the Tang and Song dynasty. So Gutenberg is not inventing the printing press. What Gutenberg does is figure out how to make the printing press faster and more efficient. So now that he's able to make the literature more available to more people in common vernacular, more people are able to read. Sometimes I think of the printing press, I put it on the same level as the internet. If you guys think about it, you open up the internet and as quickly as you can type, you're able to get information. Well, that's essentially what the printing press did as well, is that now people are able to mass produce writings in common vernacular, and now people are able to read it. So essentially, you're thinking just the same way as the internet exposes us to material, content, and knowledge, that's exactly the same thing that the printing press was doing 600 years ago. Again, exposing people to information and to knowledge. And that's why the printing press in Gutenberg gets so much publicity during the Renaissance, was just because without this instrument, a lot of the knowledge and the learning could not have happened. So one of your favorite figures from English class, William Shakespeare, he was a writer, poem maker, sonnet, storyteller, basically anything that you could have, the father of literature, during the late Renaissance in England. One of the things that people really appreciate about Shakespeare is his sense of realism with his characters. Really, again, he brings that humanistic element to each one of his stories, the hardships and the tragedies and the personal anguish and joys and expectations that all of his characters go through in all of his plays and sonnets. It's important to recognize that he very much fit this Renaissance bill. And to be honest, if he had lived a couple hundred years beforehand, his literature probably would not have been recognized simply because it was during the Middle Ages and there wasn't worth to that. So the fact that it was perfect timing, the fact that he was born and lived during the Renaissance, really created the perfect stage for him to be able to craft some of the greatest pieces of literature the world has ever seen. And hopefully not to gross anybody out, but now we have to look at some anatomy and some medicine, so hopefully the pictures just didn't turn anybody's stomach. Maybe I should have given you a warning on that. But during this Renaissance, guys, again, it's not just simply paintings and telling stories. It was this rebirth or desire to understand the world around you. Observation and study, that was something that people wanted. Again, as we mentioned earlier in the video, it's not completely breaking away from the church and it's not breaking away from religion. It's not like people woke up one day and they're like, you know what, we're not going to be Christians anymore and we're not going to believe in heaven anymore. But look at what people were just coming off of. You just had the Crusades, a couple hundred years ago. You just survived the bubonic plague. All of a sudden now you might start to question a little bit to say, we're not completely disagreeing with religion, but perhaps there's maybe a little something more that we can do. So mankind starts to study birds and migration patterns and flying. Leonardo da Vinci studied birds and actually came up with a hang glider. And he couldn't have done that without observing. You saw in the images that you could see on the slide, learning of anatomy, the idea of using cadavers. That was something that was very much against Christian teaching. The idea of cutting open a dead body was actually desecrating a body, and that should not happen. According to the church teachings, it's the idea that after the body is, or after death, body is to be buried and not to be touched, so that it can travel to heaven. So the idea of these scientists and doctors cutting open a body very much went against the teachings of the church. But during this time period in the Renaissance of questioning and inquiry and wanting to have answers, we start to see science break away a little bit more, and we start to see people really put a focus on medicine, observation, and different types of study. All right, guys, so that's the brief overview of the Renaissance. So you're going to have additional videos that I'm going to ask you to watch. One's going to be talking about the Renaissance art. I am no art historian, nor am I an art connoisseur, so I'm going to leave it to some professionals to really walk you through Renaissance art so you can really understand and appreciate what some of these great minds and individuals did during this time period. On Google Classroom, you're going to see a bunch of different readings and writings that I'm going to have you guys do. The readings and writings really are not very long, so don't worry too much about that. So you're going to have two different sets of questions that you're going to have to answer. Each one of the questions question sets are 4 questions each. Again, I'm only looking for paragraphs in length, so don't get too worried that that's going to take you too long. And you are going to have a multiple choice quiz on this content. You're going to find that on Google Forms, which I'm going to post to you guys on Friday. So for the rest of this week, obviously you just finished watching the video. Take care of the readings on Google Classroom. I'm going to put it all up on the announcement to make sure everybody's good. But it seems like this is the world that we're living in, guys, for a little bit longer. So I miss you guys. I hope all is well. I hope that you're staying safe. I hope that you're staying out of trouble. Keep following the rules. Keep doing the social distancing. Hopefully, we're going to be able to get back to school before you know it, because at this point, I'm sure we're all missing it just a little bit. All right, guys, be healthy, be well, stay safe. Take care. Bye.